Another great example of biomimicry that relates to spider silk is in the last few years, there's a company called Arnold Glass that has started making an architectural glass. And in architecture, one of the big challenges environmentally, and there's many, is that birds will strike glass. And these skyscrapers that we're building in our cities are getting taller and taller, are taking a huge toll on birds. And what they realize is that spider webs are rarely struck by birds.
Good morning, dear listeners. This is a repeat from 2012, and I apologise, we had a dropout, and so Sam Stier is excellent.
This program is sponsored by Global Health Clinics in Takapuna, your holistic and complementary health clinic on Auckland's North Shore. Our web is globalhealthclinics.co.nz, phone 488-0208. My name is Fee Rutland. I'm a natural practitioner and I work there too.
This is Bruce Lipton, and you're listening to Green Planet FM.
Kia ora, greetings, and welcome to Green Planet FM 104.6. I'm Tim Lynch, and I trust that you are doing well. I invite you to stay with me over the next hour as we discuss and find ways to take care of our unique and magnificent green planet Earth. Kia ora. Today I wish to greet all you good listeners who have tuned into this Green Planet program that has now entered its 8th year. As a voluntary labour of love, it has been a huge learning for me, which I've enjoyed and continue to derive much satisfaction, as it inspires us to be a better human, a warmer person, and a more loving participant in community, from the local all the way around to the global situation. I would dearly like to also feel that we have grown in our understanding of our place in nature and extending our cosmology of how we can benefit each other and make our life more fulfilling whilst becoming more aware. For it is really interesting. The other day a friend said to me that I would have a very conscious listening audience and that it would be continually growing. And naturally, that is the aim of this Green Planet program, to offer up viewpoints, knowledge and inspiration to extend the aura of consciousness that surrounds each one of us until sometime in the near future, I trust our knowingness will reach a critical mass that bursts through the limitations of the invisible envelope that surrounds us, extending a totally new realm of heart-centered consciousness, or global group mind, if you will. A planet with one mind, yet still being aware of our own identity. This morning I want to focus on our sustainer, our planet Gaia, and the arcane, the hidden virtues that are embedded in her being. It's like butterflies exhibit vibrant colours and stay clean using nanoscale structures on their wings. Designers and engineers have emulated this strategy to create self-cleaning coatings, fabrics and paints, plus electronic display screens. Nature's elegant solutions to building challenges include the Scots pine adaptive growth, the thorny devil's passive water collection, and a lease on-site energy production. What is being done today is to ask nature to help to solve our design challenges. This is a facet of the new paradigm that's called a biomimicry, to mimic biology, and you can follow this up at biomimicryinstitute.org. In the studio this morning, I have Sam Stier, who comes from Montana in the United States of America and has been an ecologist and moved on into biomimicry. And biomimicry is a way of studying how nature works and then being able to apply this found working to our daily life. So kia ora and welcome to New Zealand. Thank you for coming to the radio station, Sam.
Thanks very much, Tim. It's great to be here.
Sam, what brought you here to New Zealand?
Well, I'm attending a conference. It's the Society for Conservation Biology has a conference every year, and it brings together biologists who are focused on conservation issues. And this year it's in Auckland, and I am here doing a workshop about biomimicry, and specifically about how biomimicry can help conservationists communicate with the general public about the value of what they're doing. Biomimicry is broader than that, but that specifically is the focus of the workshop that I'm here for.
In studying nature, we find that there are so many things that the different biota do. And of course, for many years, they've looked at the thread of a spider and they've found out how strong it is and yet how minute it is. And also honeycomb, bee honeycomb, and how they use the honeycomb for wings of aeroplanes. And all this is basically based on natural systems.
That's right. We have a system that's operating right outside our window that we don't often realize is full of ingeniousness. And the reason for that isn't necessarily anything magical. It's that you have a system that's operated over a great length of time. I mean, a length of time that we can't really fathom with our human minds, 3.8 billion years or so. And that system has been carefully polishing every bit and piece of itself so that it's well adapted to life on this planet. And what we find interesting about that, there's a lot that's interesting about it, but from our perspective, it's not just that it's in itself just fascinating, but it actually is very relevant to the kinds of things that humans are facing today. And that's what biomimicry is all about. It's about looking to the natural world for solutions to human challenges and very practical challenges. How do we design our cities so that we don't get stuck in traffic? How do we make materials so that they don't create pollution? Those kinds of things. Nature is doing that and has been doing that for millennia. And we just haven't really appreciated that fact about nature. We haven't looked at nature in that way. And for the first time, people are starting to do that, and it's a very, very exciting time in biomimicry.
30 years ago, that wasn't a word that was really in the vocabulary, was it?
No, not at all. There's been interest, of course, in looking to nature to some degree for inventive ideas, technological solutions. That's, certainly part of history as a species, as a human species. We've been doing that for as long as we've been human. But somewhere along the line, we sort of stopped doing that. We stopped looking to the natural world for the wisdom that it contains and what it could teach us. And we started to focus more on what we could teach one another and what we could learn from one another. So that today, when you have an engineer that is going to design a new automobile, they're most likely going to speak to colleagues, to look at scientific journals, to consult reference materials, and so on. And all of that's been created over several generations of engineers, testing materials and so on. And it's not going back and saying, well, let's look at the way honeycomb, for example, is designed, as you mentioned, because here is a design that is made to be strong, yet use the minimum amount of material. And that's why slowly, especially in the airplane industry, that whole industry really has been looking at the natural world a little bit more in the design of airplanes. So it's creeping out from certain pockets and moving into other areas so that you now have people in the last 10 or 15 years looking to the natural world for technological solutions and design ideas, everything from textiles to city planning to medical devices, consumer products. It's really expanded now in the last 10 or 15 years, and that's one of the big changes, is that it's now not quite so rare as it used to be. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was a notable exception over the last several centuries, and we don't have many others of inventors who clearly look to the natural world for solutions. And in the last 15 years, things are just exploding.
Yes, but Mr. Fuller, of course, in the geodesic dome,
right,
he started things off as well, and I noticed that he looked at a lot of the backs of insects, and from tortoise shell, that there are in nature all these wonderful ways of being able to build structure or have structures hold and fall into themselves. But what you said before, when some of the examples you mentioned in medicine and being able to assist people, can you clarify that for me a little bit? Because I know that, say, snake venom can be used at a diluted state for certain things.
Well, one of the differences between biomimicry and simply using materials and chemicals that we find in the natural world. The difference is that those things may be very useful to humanity, but in biomimicry, we're really looking at ideas, concepts, design principles, chemical principles at play in the natural world, and we're learning from those. We're not farming animals, we're not taking the venom specifically, but we might look at the chemical formulas and learn the deep principles that are operating there, and then create the materials ourselves. And that's something that distinguishes biomimicry from biotechnology. And you brought up the example of spider silk. That's another material that has inspired lots of material scientists. And when people have tried to mass-produce spider silk, that's not biomimicry at all. What biomimicry is to look at exactly how the spider creates the silk and figure out what principles are in operation there, and then apply those ideas to our own manufacturing and do that in that way like the spider, but not actually farm the spider for its silk. Another great example of biomimicry that relates to spider silk is in the last few years, there's a company called Arnold Glass that has started making an architectural glass. And in architecture, one of the big challenges environmentally, and there's many, is that birds will strike glass. And these skyscrapers that we're building in our cities are getting taller and taller, are taking a huge toll on birds. And what they realize is that spider webs are rarely struck by birds. And when they look more closely at this, what's operating there is that spider webs will reflect ultraviolet light. And birds can see ultraviolet light. Humans can't, but birds can. And the thought is that over time, spiders that had created spider silk that reflected ultraviolet light were benefited by the fact that birds avoided their webs and they didn't have to keep building their webs. And the thought, too, is that birds are benefited by the fact that they don't bump into the webs and have to constantly clean themselves off. So this company, Arnold Glass, realized that if they put ultraviolet reflecting threads or coating on their windows, they might actually avoid having birds collide into those windows. And they have done that and tested it, and in fact, it works very well. The tests that they've done show that it reduces bird collisions by somewhere around 67% or so. So that is something that we've learned from spider webs, not by taking any spider webs themselves, but learning a principle in operation that works in the natural world and applying it to our own challenges, architectural challenges in this case, to help make our world a better place. And that is what biomimicry is all about.
If you can get all the scientists and move them away from the arms race or GE and to look at what nature has got. I mean, we've only had the technology in the last 15, 20 years, really, to be able to get deeply inside these little insects or other minute critters to study their fantastic ways of digestion or agitation and manufacturing a particular thing like thread or venom or whatever it might be.
That's right. I think that biomimicry comes at a really important time, not only because humanity is facing such intense challenges, but we also in the last few decades, as you mentioned, we've developed tools now that greatly expand our ability to explore what is happening in the natural world and all the different capacities that nature has to do things. So a good example is the scanning electron micrograph, which allows us to take pictures of things at a microscopic level. And, you know, right outside our window here at the studio, I'm looking at a bunch of beautiful New Zealand plants. And if you were to take the leaves of, say, I'm looking at, I think those are strawberry plants. If you were to take those strawberry plants and you were to take a leaf and stick it under a scanning electron micrograph, what you would likely see, because many leaves have this property, is not a smooth surface at all, but a very, very rough, mountainous surface. And what that does is it allows water, when it strikes the leaf, to not stick to the leaf. Instead, there's air that is actually trapped by all those mountainous structures on the leaf surface. And so that the water barely contacts the leaf, really. And because water is slightly attracted to itself, if it can't adhere to something, it forms a ball. And that's when you take a walk in the woods in the morning and you see the dew everywhere, and it's on these beautiful balls all over the leaves. And leaves accomplish that with this structure, and that allows the leaf to clean itself. A breeze comes by, the ball of water starts to roll, and as it rolls, it picks up any dirt particle along the way, and that's how the leaf remains clean. So it can photosynthesize, it doesn't have to worry about parasites and so on. That's something that we only started to appreciate in the last 20 years because of the scanning electron micrograph, and allowed us to look at a lotus leaf. That was the first leaf that we really saw this property in, and it changed how we think entirely about surface interaction. We used to think intuitively, many people still would think that if you want to keep something clean, you make a smooth surface. And in fact, at the scale that we can see leaves, they look usually very smooth. But it turns out to be exactly the opposite. And that idea has now been put into all sorts of materials, things like fabrics that have a coating on them that has a mountainous surface, so that the fabrics don't need to use chemicals to be cleaned at all. You don't have to use perfluorinated compounds, these compounds that are often used in garments that are water repellent. They have a lot of environmental issues. They don't break down in the environment and so on. You don't have to use those if we copy the way leaves have been cleaning themselves for millions of years. And that, in fact, is starting to happen now. So it's in fabrics, it's in glass. There's a concrete that's made that's self-cleaning, so you don't have to use scrubbers and lots of labor and so on. And so it's really quite wonderful.
Self-cleaning concrete.
That's right.
Because we need toilet pans that need to be self-cleaning too.
Yes, we do. I keep thinking that all the time, like, this... And it won't be long before this principle will be adopted into all sorts of materials that we want to keep clean without having to use chemicals or lots of arduous labor and so on.
Yes, it's a huge field. It was interesting. Last year I was up in New Mexico, and they've got two national laboratories there. One is Sandia, and the other is Los Alamos, where they did the atom bomb. There's 12,000 scientists in each of those laboratories, and a lot of them, a good percentage of them are working in either weapons or GE. And I heard from one of the scientists, he said, oh, look, we want to be doing so many other things. There are far more interesting things than that, from energy all the way through to essentially what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, if you're a scientist, you're interested in the world around you, and I can't imagine that you wouldn't want to explore some of the most interesting phenomena that's out there, which is often, I think, would be the natural world. So that doesn't surprise me. Yeah. I think there's been some research that's happened in those facilities that has resulted in something actually useful for people. But it's not, of course, the efficient way to do it. If you want to work on technologies that really help people, well, then that's what you focus on. So, sure, there's been some crossover there. But, yeah, I would feel the same way if I were a scientist working there.
Can I just jump in for a second? With this technology, I've always wanted to see how an essence from a flower radiates out from that flower as a perfume or as a fragrance. Have they got this technology yet?
Well, that's interesting that you bring that up. I'm not as familiar with this, but I do know that what we do in our organization, we're relatively small, but some of us focus on different things. And some of the staff work with companies that are interested in innovation inspired by nature, which is what biomimicry is. And they have looked a little bit at the way that fragrances are produced and distributed and packaged, if you will, by the natural world in order to draw inspiration from that for creating new ways of packaging things or this sort of thing. So it's hard to find areas in which biomimicry isn't relevant. It's much easier to talk about places where it does play a role. And that's not that surprising when you think about all the different types of challenges that the rest of the natural world has had to address in its 3.8 billion years of figuring out how to survive and thrive on this planet. Everything. It's done just about everything. And certainly a great deal of what it's done relates to things that we also want to do.
It's just wonderful. I mean, how evolution has worked. And, of course, we're also finding that there's more cooperation in evolution than we previously thought. The whole Darwinian way of looking at things as survival of the fittest is not necessarily true either.
You ask people, how many people have actually read Darwin's Origin of Species, and not many have. And so this phrase, survival of the fittest, I think has been really misunderstood. And I think what Darwin was saying is that nature's constantly adapting itself to the environment. And that's it. That can be done through competition. It can be done through collaboration. And each works at different times. But you're absolutely right that biologists, I think, were focused a great deal on competitive interactions in the natural world. And, of course, the natural world is so huge, so diverse, so varied, that we can't capture it at any one moment in time. So scientists start to study it, and they publish their papers, and then the media covers what's published in those papers. And so it's easy to get the impression that most of nature is like this, and maybe competitive, if it's sort of the current way of looking at the natural world amongst the scientists as a competitive environment. And so I think that has very much dominated the way most of us have thought about nature, because it was a overgeneralization from the bit of science that was being done, and which couldn't really fully describe the huge variety and wonder of nature. And now, over the last 10, 15 years, there have been scientists who are spending a lot more time exploring the way that there are cooperative relationships in the natural world, and they're finding it everywhere. I mean, it makes a lot of sense that competition might be strategy over the short term, and we do see that, but over the longer term, if you really want to have a robust, resilient, sustaining system, you're going to build connections with other organisms that are mutually sustaining, and that's what we're finding everywhere now as we continue to try to understand the natural world around us.
Certain sort of organisms find little niches in certain areas, and they live quite well within those niches. It's lovely, isn't it? It makes you feel that nature isn't as harsh, and there's a thing like blood of claw or something like that.
Right.
And that there is a softer way of doing things. And of course, we at this moment, as 7 billion human beings, we are now having to face limits to growth, and how we can pull back a little to reassess how we live nestled amidst nature and, as you say, learn from it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, I'm looking out the window here, and we've got these plants right there, and the gases that come out of my body nourish those plants, and the gases that come out of those plants nourish us. And it's like what they say about fish can't really perceive water. I think that really we have in the natural world, and the overarching theme is cooperation, collaboration, mutual benefit. That's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. And yet it is perhaps so obvious, at least to the scientists that have been exploring this for a while, that they're not going to publish papers anymore about that fact. And so, again, what's taken up by the general public through the conduit of the media, perhaps, is that, we forget about these things about nature that are all around us. They're like water to a fish. And instead we focus on whatever else is being discussed. But I think that what's wonderful about biomimicry is it brings us back to paying attention to some things about the natural world that are so pervasive that we've forgotten to dwell and appreciate them. Things like the fact that nature is so productive, produces so much and so many materials, and it does all of it with a chemistry that is at ambient temperatures, whether that's in the ocean or the air. Humanity, on the other hand, pretty much most of our technologies in the last 100, 150 years have relied on raising temperatures, using fossil fuels to create all sorts of things. And now, of course, we know that is having severe consequences on the environment. And biomimicry it turns our attention back to the natural world, but in a new way. It frames the natural world in a way that we haven't before, perhaps because we haven't really needed to appreciate nature in that way, and now we really do. Now we really need to look out the window and say, holy cow, how does nature produce all that stuff but not have to use a drop of oil? Wouldn't it be cool if we could create all the things that we want to make without having to produce carbon dioxide? There's been some wonderful work in this area as well. There's been a lot of interest in corals, for example. Corals create a material, calcium carbonate, and that material is the number one material that we use in our concrete. It's essential for our concrete. And in fact, the way we create concrete is we go to a quarry and we mine up old limestone, old calcium carbonate, the skeletons of corals, and we dig it up. And then what do? We cook it. We cook it to make it have a particular molecular structure that then when you add water, it becomes hard and we can use it as concrete. Well, corals are creating the exact same material, right? They're creating calcium carbonate, but they're making the materials not by quarrying anything, not by ripping open the earth and digging and blasting and so forth. None of that. It simply pulls these calcium and carbon atoms out of the seawater, and it does it at ocean ambient temperatures. It doesn't have to use any fossil fuel, and it assembles it into this hard calcium carbonate, the very thing that we're trying to make. And what people have been doing, what biomimics have been doing in the last 8 years, is looking at the chemistry that corals use to create this calcium carbonate and figuring out a way for us to do the same thing. And what's just amazing about what they've been able to do is they have been able to mimic the chemical formulas that corals use and the chemical processes that corals use to create calcium carbonate. And now they can take carbon dioxide that's coming through a flue stack or carbon dioxide that's coming out of exhaust pipe from a car, and they can bubble it through seawater, and they can pull out the atoms and assemble the molecules that create calcium carbonate, and they can do it like corals do without having to mine anything, without having to burn any oil. In fact, the kind of calcium carbonate they're making is pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and fixing it into a useful construction material. And it's very, very exciting.
I mean, this is new paradigm. We're really on the threshold of a whole new world and a future that we can look forward to.
Absolutely. I agree. I think that's one of the nicest things about biomimicry is to me, it's optimistic. It's solution-oriented, and it looks at nature in a different way. And, I think that we all love nature. We all appreciate the natural world in various ways. But we have, as this conflict has gone on between humans and the rest of the natural world, we have taken on an attitude of sort of feeling sorry about the natural world, pitying the loss of nature and so on. And biomimicry allows us to recognize the genius in the natural world and get excited about it and celebrate all of this wonderful ideas around us and how helpful it can be for us. And so it's a very optimistic thing. It sort of puts the optimism back into environmentalism. And I think that environmentalism has been very well-intentioned, but over the last 20, 30, 40 years that we've been doing it, it's hard to make it optimistic. And I think biomimicry really helps us do that and recognize that nature is not something to just find pretty or remorse at its loss, but to really, really admire it and appreciate what it can do. And
praise it.
Exactly. And in the process, you sort of fall in love with nature all over again.
Yes, well, this is how I feel, too, of a big picture. Because when you walk up to the top of a mountain or a hill or stand on a beach somewhere, and you can have this magnificent feeling of love and connection. And now with biomimicry, we are seeing that within the DNA of all these different animals and plants, we've got this DNA too, and there's a connection with us. It's like, I think the cutworm has about 66% of the same DNA as a human being.
Yes, and our bodies, it's been on a journey, a 3.8 billion year journey as well, and there's genius in the way we are designed. These very things, these microphones we're speaking in, any loudspeaker that we use is something that was actually the breakthrough for Alexander Graham Bell in coming up with the loudspeaker, was looking at the human eardrum. And what he was looking for is some way of turning audio, sound energy into electrical energy. And that is exactly what the human eardrum does. And when he recognized that the human eardrum was performing the same function that he wanted to create in order to make a loudspeaker and a telephone and so on, he really started to study the human eardrum and how it worked. And he came up with a way of mimicking that has resulted in the loudspeaker that we're using in this very sound room.
It comes right back to us, doesn't it?
It always does.
It's lovely, Sam, because we have the salamander, and when it loses a limb, it can grow a limb back. Now, this would be a wonderful thing for the human species to be able to manifest.
Absolutely. This ability, nature heals itself. I have two little boys, Julio and Kestrel, and they're 7 and 3. And one of the delights is when they do get nicked and, a little cut or scrape here and there, I just love to talk to them about how their body is going to heal themselves. And we check at the scab every day, and we marvel at how the body heals itself. And I will bring this to biomimicry because there's a gentleman who had the same experience of appreciating this fact, and he started to think about how when we get a cut in our skin, we have these platelets moving through, and then there's this capacity to seal the wound. And he thought, that is exactly what we need to do with any pipeline that we use to transport any materials. If there's a puncture in that pipeline, it's the time it takes to get there and fix it that leads to a great deal of damage. And so he started a company called Brinker Technologies, and they basically have a system that's modeled on our own circulation system, which can detect when there is a rupture in a pipeline, and there's material that's constantly moving through that pipeline that will automatically go and seal that puncture up. And so that all was inspired by appreciating the fact that our own bodies do much the same thing. We could talk all day because there's so many examples of people drawing inspiration from the natural world to solve human challenges that you would never in a million years guess that nature had a solution for, but it does.
Yes, you can see why indigenous peoples had this relationship with the natural world. They had reverence for trees, they had reverence for stones, they had a total affiliation with nature because they recognized they were born with it.
Yeah. I think that there weren't so many distractions for indigenous peoples. Sometimes I think, when I look around, I think about how many ants and colonies live. And in their mounds, they're very cut off, it seems to me, from the world around them. And I mean this purely by analogy because, of course, ants are very integrated ecologically. But I think humans, the more we have built up our own world, we're just not in regular day-to-day contact with the natural world. There's so many distractions, you can begin to believe that somehow we are separate from the natural world, simply because in our day-to-day experience, we seem to be. You spend your day maybe driving down a road and going into an office building, and then back you go to home and so on. So I think that the native cultures that we have, that they were simply not as distracted by all of that, so they couldn't get fooled into thinking these things. And what was clear is that they were very much part of nature. There's no separation whatsoever. So we're struggling almost with a psychological problem in that way for the modern culture that we have today, in believing that somehow we are separate from nature when, of course, when we really think about it, we're not in the slightest.
I agree. I know that in New Zealand in summer, particularly, we have around about 5 weeks, 6 weeks school holidays that are integrated with Christmas. And New Zealanders just leave the city in droves, and they'll go to the beach, or they'll go to a lakeside, or maybe up in the mountains. And a lot of that time they'll spend barefooted. And this is where we feel that we make our connection. And I'd like to say that New Zealanders as a country have a point of difference with a lot of other people, particularly in the Western world, in the European world, because as there's no snakes or poisonous spiders or anything like that, we can go around barefooted, and so the soles of our feet connect with the earth a lot more.
Wonderful feeling. I was in Albert Park today, and I saw your sort of prototypical businessman with the suit on and everything, and he was taking the most lovely nap laying on the ground in Albert Park, and I just really, really loved, appreciated that. Yeah, I think you're right, and I also think that you look around the world and in industrial countries, and pretty much everywhere you look, on holiday, people do take off to natural places a great deal. And I think that just underscores the fact that people do love nature, and nobody wants this situation we're in right now. Nobody would pick this and desire this combative conflict we have where everything we do leads to environmental damage. What we want is to continue what we're doing, improve our lives, and have that work with the rest of the natural world, and have what we do actually be good for the environment. I mean, imagine if you could throw things away and not feel bad about it, and not because you were living some illusion, but because what you were throwing away was nutrients for the rest of the world around us and produced yet more things. And that's how nature operates. And I think one of the wonderful things about biomimicry is it really changes how we think about moving forward with our environmental agenda. We've been stuck without solutions, without technological solutions of this kind. We've really been stuck saying, well, this conflict we have with nature, this damage we do to the environment can't be avoided, and so we need to reduce how much we use. We need to conserve. And those things are all true given the fact that our technologies are not restorative for the earth. The things that we do when we throw something away, it's a problem. If, in fact, our technologies were such that, like the rest of the natural world, when we were done with something, it became nutrients for something else, and the cycle was closed and productive, then we really wouldn't have these conflicts that we have seemed insurmountable and unavoidable over the last 40 years. We'd have a completely new horizon and a new world that we could imagine in which we didn't have to somehow restrict ourselves and not use things. We could, in fact, continue living in the way that we wanted to, create materials, produce things, live our lives, and all of that would not harm the rest of the natural world. It had actually helped the rest of the natural world. And you think about the concrete example we spoke about earlier. I think most of us would say, well, concrete is something we need, yeah, but, it's very environmentally destructive. But once you understand that corals, for example, have been creating the same material for millions of years, and in the process they create a fantastic habitat for thousands of species of fish and other creatures in the ocean, you start to understand that it's not a necessary consequence of living that you're environmentally destructive at all. In fact, is the exception to the rule. All of the species around us are very productive. They create things, they throw things away, but they're part of a system that is always using everything and productive. And that's exactly the way we need to start asking our technologies, expecting our technologies to perform in that way, to function in that way. And once we do that, this cage that we feel like we're in, I think will just dissolve.
There's no waste in nature, and Dr. Elizabeth Sartoris, who's a geobiologist, came to New Zealand and Australia some years ago, and when she said that, there's no waste in nature, it reminded me, because I've spent a little bit of time underwater in tropical regions, and you do see a large fish defecate, and as soon as it defecates, another fish smaller than that will come in and eat that. And then when that smaller fish defecates, another smaller fish comes in, and it goes all the way down the line until finally there's only sort of like a watery dust or of small particles that get collected by a sea anemone, and it sucks it all in, and the water's clean. Yeah. It's all cleaned up. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I sometimes think that, ecosystems are nature's way of recognizing the opportunity of waste and making the most of waste. And that's really what ecosystems are. There's this wonderful system, and we find them everywhere, right? They cover the planet. And the reason why they do cover the planet is because it's really the only system that could work over the long haul. And that's, we need to look at those ecosystems and mimic them. We need to copy the way they function in the ways that they do, but simply with the materials and the products, etc., that we want in our lives. And once we accomplish that, I think that we will be freed of this conflict that we felt that we've been in and we couldn't escape from.
So there has to be a big shift in awareness. Where do you see this as coming other than with your groups? Business usually wants to capitalize on any situation. Do you have sort of conscious people in governments worldwide that are looking at this, particularly as we are now getting close to a crisis of ecological, financial, and societal proportions?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, what we focus on a great deal is education. The way we started is that it started with a woman named Janine Benyus. And Janine was someone who was writing books about, she'd write the kind of book you'd find at, say, a national park about all of the organisms there and the ways that they live, the way that they're adapted to the environment at the park and so on. And she was doing this for ecological regions throughout North America. And, of course, she was struck by the amazing adaptiveness, the way all of these organisms fit into the environment. But she also became curious of whether people were looking to these organisms for ways of solving human technological challenges. And she started to explore that. And she'd occasionally bump into stories where, someone was looking at spider silk or someone was looking at honeycomb and so on. And she would just file those away in a file cabinet. And when that file cabinet became full, she realized she had a book. And she wrote this book called Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. And this was in 1997. And the book, in many ways, what she does is she looks across a bunch of researchers who are looking to the natural world, who are, looking to the abalone for ideas about how to manufacture at ambient temperatures, and lots of different researchers looking to nature for very specific reasons. And she saw across all of their work this common theme that they were looking to nature. Nature's been designing the world for 3.8 billion years. There's a lot to learn there, a lot of wisdom. And she realized, well, this is the way forward. This is what we need to be doing. And up until that point, none of those researchers necessarily identified themselves as being part of a movement, part of a paradigm shift in the kind of science we might do or the way we might look at the natural world. And so since that time, we have spent a great deal of time thinking, well, how do you take this fantastic idea that's so interesting, so compelling? Where do you spend your time with people and talking about this idea? And it's honestly, there's no one answer because everyone can benefit from this idea. So we've done consulting with companies that are doing research and development and creating new products, new materials, new manufacturing processes. We've spent time with those folks. We've spent time with teachers because this is a wonderful idea for students to learn about. We've spent time with governments talking about this idea. And one of our challenges is where should we spend our time? And the reason I think it is difficult to know the answer to that is because human culture is a very complicated system with no single one leverage point. And I tend to feel, especially right now, as I think many people do, that government may not be the best place to spend all of our time. There's a lot of ways to change human culture, and government and regulation and so on is only one way, and it really can't be effective unless also people participate, right? And so Buckminster Fuller, he brought up, I think he pretty much said something along the lines of, don't bother about quibbling about technology, simply create a better technology, and that will change the world.
That's right.
Yeah, and so in some ways that's more my approach to this, is that I think we don't, that's really what we need to do, is help support these innovators who are changing the way we can do what we need to do, and that will change the world. And, in our work, we're really interested in inspiring the next generation. And so we spend a lot of our time working with teachers, whether they're all the, preschool teachers, high school teachers, university professors. That's the folks that we spend a great deal of our time talking with and helping them so that they feel comfortable talking about biomimicry with their students. And we've seen a lot of change happen in just a few years through that process. When you walk in as a first-year undergrad in biology, you kind of know, okay, I'm going to learn about biology, and I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do with it. But when you start to talk about biomimicry with those students, and they see that biology is a window into a world of ways you can improve how we create cars, how we drive, how we do our manufacturing, how we make our fabrics, all of that just blows their mind away. And they become turned on, inspired by what they're studying to a level that they simply weren't before, because they understand now that it is highly relevant. It is the key. It is one of the most important things you could do with your life. And so we feel like education is an amazingly important pivotal area in changing human culture. So that's one of the areas we focus on a lot. The other areas in which we focus on are sort of more passive, in that we'll get calls from reporters, media, and so on, and we'll definitely love to talk about biomimicry with those folks because they're reaching a lot of people through the television and so on. And I think that when the general public hears about this idea, it's very compelling. It sort of changes the way they've been taught to think about nature, the environment, technology. It completely changes the ways we've been taught to think about these things.
And as you said before, because we're sharing breath with this planet, because we're taking in water, because we're eating from a food chain, there are all these three different cycles that are going on. So there's 7 billion people churning through air, water, and matter on this planet. So that's just one significant aspect of our connection. And then, as you say, when we focus our attention on all the other aspects, it's wild, because I just want to ask one thing. And I'd like everybody to really look at that. If we go to the fridge and take an egg carton out and have a look at an egg and have a look and say, okay, which end is the start and which end is the finish of that egg? And when that egg finally came out of that chook or that chicken, how did it seal that egg and seal such alive goodness on the inside and then bring it into this world? I mean, this is wild.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, eggs are a lot of fun. You could think about them all day.
That's right, and they're so resilient and so strong in so many ways. You can put them in a situation they can roll all over the place and take quite a knock unless they're dropped from a height.
Yeah, it's a fun thing you can do with kids, have them try to actually break them with their hand. You'd think, well, that would be a snap to do, but you can't do it. They're too strong, and they use such a little amount of material to create something that is immensely strong, and part of the way they do it is their curvature. And you see, in this room we're in right now, what I see is a great many 90-degree angles, because that's how we build things. Well, nature, it's hard-pressed to find a 90-degree angle. It's not that that's necessarily bad, but you see a great many curves in the natural world, and engineers, for example, are starting to appreciate this fact, and they're looking at, for example, the way trees will create certain curves where the bottom of their trunk meets the earth. And that curve is a very special curve. It's a special kind of curve that is immensely strong. You find that kind of curve in many places across the egg surface, in the spiral of nautilus shells that you find on the beach. And the various functions these curves serve have a lot of applicability to making our technologies much better. Let me give you an example. There's a company in California called Pax Scientific, and they make a line of devices that turn, rotary devices. And we, of course, use rotors in fans, propellers, pumps, all sorts of things. And we haven't really changed the design of our rotors a whole lot for, several centuries at the minimum. And J. Harmon is this inventor who really was taken with this curvature he saw in the natural world so frequently. As a kid, he'd watch kelp and how it responded to the movement of surf, and he noticed that the kelp was swirling and turning into a curve, much the way the little tornado of water, the water vortex, happens when you unplug the drain in your bath. And he carefully measured this curvature, and then he applied that design to rotors. And when he tested them, he found that they were upwards of 75% more efficient. They used much less energy to move the same amount of air or water, whatever you want to move. And the reason was because that kind of curvature is the way nature moves water and air. And we simply haven't mimicked it. And now we're starting to.
We have about 43 hydroelectric dams in this country. And if we just put new rotors on every one of these dams, we don't need to produce any more electricity by burning coal and burning gas or anything else. So here it is. Nature has got the answers. Wow. And on top of that, when you mentioned the Nautilus shell, then comes in the golden mean and that fantastic ratio and sacred geometry is all embedded. The pine cone, the unfolding of a fern frond, and the way a fish's scale is... It's everywhere.
And when you see something like that, when you see a pattern that's showing up so often in the natural world, you've got to start to think, okay, there's something that works here, and it works really well because lots of different organisms that are only distantly related have discovered the same types of geometries.
Sam, this is fantastic. What is the best thing for mums and dads with their children at the moment?
I guess you could start to talk about this idea with their teachers. We have a website, of course, with lots of educational materials. It's at biomimicryinstitute.org, and that's a place to start. And gosh, I mean, there's a world to discover. Take your kids, of course, outside and think yourself about what you're seeing in the natural world. You know, how is that? Why is it that shape? What's going on there? Why does that look like that design might actually be something really helpful? Could you think of applying that design too in order to fix something? And even if it's just for fun, to design things for fun or to think about this sort of thing, it enhances the way you experience the natural world to learn about biomimicry, even if you're not an engineer. And of course, if you are, well, then you've got 3.8 billion years of teachers to learn from.
On an Earth that is round, that spins around a sun that is round, and a galaxy that is circular and spiral, I mean, it's everywhere.
That's right.
Sam, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. It's been a lot of fun.
That was Sam Stier. And you can follow through on biomimicryinstitute.org. And you can follow through on biomimicryinstitute.org. This is today, 29th of October, 2020. Hi, everybody. Again, this is Tim. I want to appraise you of what's happening with Green Planet FM. We've been going for 17 years now, and a lot has happened, and we've brought through a lot of good ideas, and we are building up a presence on the web. We're getting close on 10,000 hits a week. However, they're not really from New Zealand. They're from elsewhere. We come out of a sky tower across Auckland, 1.6 million people. However, our greatest following comes from overseas, and so this is a very interesting story. But we all know that New Zealand, in essence, many people want to know solely because in many ways we are a safe haven to a degree that we're at least out of the way, which doesn't mean anything really, because in today's world things can happen that can affect anywhere and anyone on the planet. So I'm just wanting to let you know that this is the go. Anyway, what we wanted to do is we're going to be looking at doing short videos, a lot of short videos and short shows, because nobody's really got the time they haven't got 1 hour to be able to sit in and take in the luxuriant information that we offer out. And so we're going to be looking at doing things from bullet points and quick statements to be able to just fire up to let you know that you can actually do something and that there are people in the community wanting to be able to help you and assist you and make this a better world, particularly for our children. Because as you know, our planet is in a very challenging moment in the world today, and there's 7.8 billion human beings sharing breath, and we want to make sure that we have a future for all children, all biota, and that life will be enjoyable for all people. It's a big ask, but this is where the situation's leading us. We've really got to fire up because we've been impelled to be the change that we want always to see, that at heart we always wanted to be. Thank you.
And a couple of years ago, this piece was in the letters to the editor of the New Zealand Herald, July 21st, 2009, from R.B. Elliott, Professor Emeritus, Child Health Research in Remuera, Auckland, titled Bread's Toxicity. The standard demanding the addition of micrograms of the B vitamin folate to bread to prevent neural tube defects and possibly many other diseases has been greeted in some quarters as heresy. To put this in perspective, we should look at what else is added to bread to increase the profit of wheat growers, millers, and bakers without any health benefit whatsoever. In the wheat field, any one or more of the pesticides listed in the 11 pages of the European Union database for these agents are used. Pre- and post-emergent herbicides are also used, as well as toxic fungicides. Millers use antibacterial and antifungal agents and add similar agents to the milled flour to prevent spoilage. Any folic acid in wheat is removed in milling. At the bakery, improvers are added to produce an airy loaf. These are usually a mix of chemicals, including a large amount of ascorbic acid, vitamin C. Oxidized vitamin C is quite toxic. Wheat farmer Bill English, when Minister of Health for the national government, asked, "Why should we worry about a bit of B vitamin? That will do some good. You should see what is added to the wheat at the farm." Today, of course, Bill English is the Minister of Finance for the present government. So listeners, the most important thing, organic. Go for organic flour, go for organic bread. That is the way forward if we want our children to be healthy as well as yourself. That is Earth Files for this week. Thank you for tuning into this Green Planet radio show. I trust you have derived both enjoyment and insight as we empower ourselves with a greater understanding of the magnificent, multifaceted world that we inhabit. In these coming times of rapid change, it's going to take raw courage and inner resolve. And so I thank you as we all remain both focused yet relaxed as we challenge the status quo and let go of the old as we energetically co-create the new paradigm. Because I can assure you, every one of you are important now. When you go to bed tonight, ready for well-earned rest and sleep, realize that what you think, feel, and do is part of your unfolding destiny. And when we commit to a higher act of goodwill and or community service, Providence also lines up. So that every conversation we have, every email we send, every phone call we make, and every meeting we attend, that we stand in our power and communicate intelligently, warmly, with integrity, knowing that we are actively shaping a collective future that will benefit all our children and grandchildren, as well as that of the larger community. This is Tim Lynch in Auckland from Nuclear Free New Zealand and mobilising unity consciousness, wishing you a stupendous week of heartfelt success. I say bye-bye and haere rā.